So, good afternoon. Here we are recording again. Thank you for inviting me to witness this beautiful journey of your life.
Thank you, Leon, for being here and joining me
mm,
on this journey. It's quite interesting what comes up when we actually chat.
Yes, I think I'm very keen on co-learning, collaborative learning. And as I ask the questions and you answer, some more lights and insights light up in my neural net. So I really enjoy the way that we do it. And I can really recommend that for our community as well, is to start these co-ventures of co-learning and co-habitating this beautiful content that will help us to evolve.
Absolutely.
So, so one of the things that prompted me this week to think and also to place something on the community is this wonderful book of, is it Mark Vollen, that wrote the book, It Didn't Start With You. Obviously, the premise is that we all always feel kind of guilty when we go through certain experiences and certain emotional experiences that makes us uncomfortable. And I think this book suggests that let's look at the wider context. Let's look where we come from and where else does this thing that we experience also make sense up in our family tree. So I think today our topic is about, let's explore the lane, first the feminine line, and your mother, your biological mother's line, and then later the masculine line. So maybe that's a good start for today.
I like that start. I think that's a good place to start. Yes. So if I look at my mother's ancestry, as you know, I grew up in Namibia, and that means where did we come from? So the story is, and this is a family story, and I'm only repeating what I have learned in the family history. So my mother's mother had quite a story to tell. And she was quite a feisty woman. She was the youngest of what I know, 3 siblings, 2 brothers who were much older than her, and then herself. The one brother was a bookkeeper, what we would call a CA today, and things weren't going well for them in Germany. His mother was very ill. The opportunity came. They were looking for people in Namibia, and so he brought out his mother, and my grandmother at that time was only 12 years old when they came to Namibia. So before they came to Namibia, there is quite a story. So the story is that my grandmother's mother, so my great-grandmother, was married to what they called a Seemann in German. So he was on the sea. They came from Hamburg. So he got lost at sea with one of his ships sank, and he got lost at sea, which left the family in a very difficult situation because all of a sudden there was no more money coming in. At that time, my grandmother was a baby, and there was not enough food to feed her. And the story is that she then was placed into a care home, that, you know, like a children's home.
Afrikaans, we say a weeshuis or a foster home.
Yeah, it wasn't a foster home. It was more a government children's home.
Mm.
That is part of the story that I know. What then? There's a story that goes even further, that her grandmother had 2 children. The one was a son, and the other one was my grandmother's mother, my great-grandmother. That family was extremely wealthy. Now, my great-great-grandmother was married to a developer. With other words, he was a construction guy, and he developed his own housing estates. And there was a whole street. It was a short street, but there were several houses in that street that were the properties. So they were extremely wealthy. And these children, so that the son actually had everything going for him. And his father passed away before the war, and I'm believing it to be the First World War if I look at the time period. And this great uncle of mine was a soldier in the war, but he had a very, very bad habit of gambling. And he was
he
was a gambler, and he lost a lot in his betting. Was not married, was still young, and it ended up, the way he got more money out of his mother was he'd go to her, put a gun to his head, and say, if you don't get me out of this debt, I will shoot myself. And she then lost everything to his gambling debt, and it literally made her lose her mind, because in the end he did commit suicide, and she, as a result, landed in an asylum. When she found out that her grandchild was in a children's home, it shook something in her. And she then went and took this little girl out of the children's home at the age of about 3 or 4. So what we now know is that I ended up in a boarding school, but it's almost like this pattern is a repeat pattern.
Yeah.
So when my grandmother's mother lost her husband and they fell into poverty because there was nothing, it was very difficult for the family, and the mother then had cancer. And because this young man, that was my grandmother's brother, was educated, he felt he needed to be educated. So he came to Namibia and brought his brother, who was, realized that he was in the jewelry trade. So he was a tradesman and then became a jeweler. And my grandmother was 12 years old when they came to Namibia. So the history, therefore, is that there is this legacy in the family of gambling, addiction, and that type of what we would call really difficult, because there was so much money, there was so much wealth, and it was all gone just because of that. So that's a tragedy that that I know of. So my grandmother, who was this 12-year-old coming to Namibia, she was a rather wild child. And if you look at her history, she didn't have a father, who died when she was a little girl, in this children's home, then with this grandmother who took her out of this children's home, but was also very lost in herself. And then when the grandmother died, going back, being transported to another country, and basically under the custodianship of her brother. And she and her brother didn't see eye to eye at all, because he tried to do the best he could take care of his mother, and then this wild child, as she was known as. So here is the wild child.
So there's definitely a repeat of certain patterns and a recognition of certain aspects of the family tree that repeats itself until it's discovered and looked at.
Yes. So she fell pregnant at the age of 16. But before she fell pregnant, she didn't go to school. She worked in what we call a general dealer as and so she earned her own income, but she lived with her brother and her mother until the mother died. And there was this old man who always used to come into the general dealer, who was an ex-officer in the German force. But he, at that time, he was working on a farm and doing odd jobs around. But he used to come into this general dealer, and he fancied my grandmother a lot. And he always said, one day I will marry you. And she always said, not in this lifetime. So she had this real, he fancied her, and she had this total, you're too old for me. I have no fancy in you, etc., etc., until she fell pregnant. And then when he came home, she sat on his doorstep crying, and he said, what's the matter? And she said, I'm pregnant. And if I go home now, my brother will kill me. So he said, don't worry. He always said he was going to marry her. So he did the honorable thing, and he said, your child will have a name, and I will marry you. So he was a good 25 years older than her. So he was a bachelor boy. He was just a very singular man, and he then got this gift of this woman that he always fancied, this young girl that he always fancied. And it did create a rift between my mother and my grandmother and her brother, who didn't speak to her for over a year because the shame she brought onto the family. So I understand this feeling of shame that he was trying to get away from in Germany, and here his sister is repeating another shame pattern. So he was devastated, but my just trying to work out, it was my uncle was born because he was first. So my uncle was born as basically without not knowing who his father is. So that's very interesting that this is a pattern that is also continuing. And then I believe that my aunt was then the old man's child, and then it is believed that my grandmother loved flirting with a lot of men. She was beautiful, she was vivacious, she was cheeky, she was a wild child, so she enjoyed life. So there is a rumor that my mother's father is not the husband's child.
Okay.
So there is always this little bit of secret that is in the family.
So we've covered quite a lot about your biological mother. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add for this conversation.
I think that is as much as I know. I don't know too much about her father. All I know is that he was one of the troops that came out as a soldier, and he stayed behind working as a farmhand or whatever job he could find. And he didn't really have a lot of ambition in life other than just surviving, but he was very, very good with his hands. He was a good carpenter. So when him and my grandmother got married, he then went to what, the rubbish dump, as it were, and he found wood, and he built furniture from the wood that he found on the rubbish dump. And you
Amazing.
wouldn't say that this is not that it's wood that he found on the rubbish dump. He made furniture with whatever wood he could find. He was a brilliant carpenter, and he then also he worked at the municipality. Eventually he worked himself up to be the head technician and the head electrician. He had a very clever brain, and I think having a family to support gave him a reason to really go beyond what he would have otherwise done. And he was apparently a very calm man. So my mother grew up with a very calm man, but when he lost his temper, he would you would know you've pressed too many buttons right now. So I think she grew up in a very protected environment in that sense. As protected, as poor as it was very protected, and she didn't really lack for anything as far as love from her parents was concerned.
But it's also a lovely study in understanding the different layers of human consciousness. The fact that the financial wobbly hit them, no money, they had to go to a land of new opportunity. But emotionally and spiritually and all of those levels, it was all shaken up. And one could understand that it had a chaotic impact on the system.
Very chaotic. The other element that does come in is they lived in the village they lived in Namibia, Okahandja, was also the main seat of the Lutheran missionary church in Namibia. And so my mother's godmother was Dr. Heinrich Fedder, who was the leading missionary who came out to Namibia at that time. So if you're looking at what I shared before about my convent roots, there is this very strong rooting of needing a sense of belonging, a sense of stability, which came in the form of at least having this connection to the German missionary church, which basically was their guiding light at that time.
Right. So that was the feminine line, grandmother, and then your uncle and so on that was born. And so do you want to explore a little bit deeper into how your mother grew up?
So my mother was 10 years younger than her eldest brother. So there was a big age gap. And she was, there was 7 years between her sister and herself. Through family constellations, I learned that there were a miscarriage or two before her. So understanding that the doctors were not really available. And my grandmother, when she was pregnant with my mother, she loved sports. She just enjoyed life to the fullest. So my mother was born at 5 months old, and she was so tiny that they put her in a shoebox, then took her through to Windhoek to a doctor and to a home, and she survived, and obviously had a very strong will to live, which is why I'm here today. Otherwise I wouldn't be here.
Yeah. So she was born in a shoebox, tiny, and did she share anything about her upbringing with you?
She had a happy childhood as far as she was concerned. She was very close to her father. And then she always wanted to become a nurse. She always wanted to be in the healing field. And then she managed to get into the convent. Somebody gave her a grant. She did 2 years in the convent, which is where her affiliation with the convent came about. But she left the convent at the end of what we now call grade 10, because at that time it was like grade 10 was considered, you were 16, you were old enough to leave school. Although I think she was slightly younger than that. And then she went to work in the company where she then met my father. But she worked there for quite a few years, obviously, before she became pregnant with me.
Yeah. So this was then before she met your stepfather.
Yeah, so she worked until she became pregnant with me, and then there is we shared the story of what happened there. But during the time when she was growing up, the German men were interned into camps in South Africa. And a lot of boys or a lot of children didn't have opportunity to go home, which is what happened with my stepfather. He was in school with my mother's brother, and in boarding school in Swakopmund, in the German school, and there was nobody to go home to because his mother had passed away, and he would go home with his friend, my mother's brother, and that's actually how they met, is that he went for holidays, he went with his friend, and to basically my grandmother's house or grandparents' house, and spent quite a few holidays with them. And then she was, as I say, a young girl who enjoyed life. She also, like her mother, enjoyed life to the fullest. My stepfather was very musical. So he played the accordion. He had somebody who played the drums and somebody who played the guitar, and they made music. So he made his income by playing on festivals. So he was booked out throughout the year, playing for a party here and a fest there and somewhere else. And that's basically how he made his income. And the story always goes that my mother used to start dancing on a Friday evening and fall into bed on a Sunday afternoon, ready for work on a Monday morning. So
it's such a lovely story. I can hear the music, those boereorkes instruments.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
So that is so he didn't become available to my mother because she was that much younger. And anyway, she went there to dance and with her friends and so on. But obviously, knowing him gave her some advantages in the sense of choosing the music she wanted to dance to, etc., etc. So yeah, so that is how he made his living, other than being on the farm that was his father's farm. So the story there is also very interesting. His father came out as a soldier from Germany and then managed to appropriate or buy a farm in Namibia. Now, if you know Namibia, it's very, very barren. And the farm he bought had 2 yielding crops. The one was chalk. Literally, they used chalk to build houses with, or to make the plaster with, and things like that. So
it's like a powder. Yeah,
yes, like a white powder. And then the other one was they started farming with karakou sheep, because the Karak
Yes.
were quite adaptable to that country and could survive the barrenness, because they could feed off the tiny grasses and the little bit of greenery off the shrubs. So that was how they basically made their money.
And the wool was very, very sought after internationally, even then.
It wasn't the wool. They actually used
I thought,
the skin of the newborn lambs, and they
oh,
made these
yes.
karakul coats, which
Oh,
today you
yes.
wouldn't do anymore because it is obviously no longer attractive with with the cruelty and things like that.
Yeah.
But at
So
that time, it
that's
was very sought after material.
yeah, yeah. For coats and stuff like that in winter in
Yes,
Europe.
yes, it
Mm.
was export. It was exported at and
Mm.
made good revenue.
Yeah.
Um,
So, yeah. So in a sense, they came with a certain skill. Afrikaans we call it ambach, but they know how to woodwork. They knew all sorts of farming skills, and they came to a barren land and land of opportunity, and they created opportunities for themselves. So it was in a sense very entrepreneurial, but they came with trauma and they came with a lot of pain as well.
well, if we look at the history, Germany at that time was going through, um, not just Germany, Europe as a whole. The people were hungry. There was no food, and so a barren land meant I can at least have land where I can grow food, no matter what the cost. So as long as you got land close to a river, you could plow and you could grow crops. But then came, and it was during the Second World War that the German men from Namibia were interned in South Africa, and this meant that the farm was not managed. My stepfather at that time was still at school, and so there was nobody on the farm. So before the men were released, my father went back to the farm, and the farm then was occupied by the Herreros, who were the original inhabitants of that land. And my father then renegotiated the land to be in his father's name, because it could prove that the land had been obviously signed over through the deed. There was a deed in place, and so on. So my stepfather, single-handedly renegotiated his father's position, which meant he couldn't go back to school. He needed now to stay on the land, because that was the only way he could save this farm from going back to the Herreros at that time.
So became a farmer at a very early age.
He became a farmer at a very, very early age. And if it wasn't for him, his father would have lost the farm, which is obviously a double tragedy when we look at what happened when the father said, "You cannot have the farm. I don't know who I'm going to leave the farm with." So there is this double whammy, basically. I have saved you your farm, and yet I'm not even good enough to be considered that this is my land, that this is my farm. So that is very, very sad in the father-son relationship of the time. And being a young man, it was very, very difficult then for him when his father did come back, because then there was obviously this ego between father and son. This farm is, I have earned my keep on this farm. And his father sent him away for a year to study in Stellenbosch. He went and studied at a winery in Stellenbosch and did an apprenticeship in Stellenbosch. And I think it was just to get him out of the father's hair for some time, in which time the father remarried, and had 7 children with the second wife. So my father is the middle of 3 children. So he has an older sister, it was him, and then a younger sister. And then during the time when he wasn't there, his father remarried, and had 7 children with the second wife.
Yeah, those were the stories of that time, even in my family system.
Stories of the time, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I don't know too much about the history of his mother and his father. That is basically all I know is of that time where he comes from.
You mean your stepfather?
My stepfather, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So while we're on that, just maybe a brief comments or notes why in family constellations we are more interested generally about the primarily parent or the biological parent, and that the step parents or the adopted parents almost has a secondary position. Maybe you want to just share a few thoughts about that.
Well, the thing is, the step parent is not the direct bloodline. And for me, my experience was he was a very broken man. And he grew up with a lot of, the Germans have a very straight down the line, right or wrong. And his father was very militaristically minded. So even when we as children came and visited there, if you sat on the table, you had to sit with your back straight. You had to put your hands in a certain position. It was the dinner table or the breakfast table or the lunch table. It was very militaristic. You didn't dare to speak. It wasn't a fun event. It was, the food was given in from the eldest to the youngest, and you were given food, and you either liked it or you didn't, but you had to eat what was put on your plate. So it was very harsh. And growing up in this very harsh environment, it was taught as a love language. I'm doing this so that you can survive. And looking at it from a point of survival, you had to follow the line, otherwise you did not survive. If you were weak, you did not survive. And that was really how the house was governed. So with his brokenness, it did impact me quite a lot on that level. However, we had a very, very strong bond, and I understood him, and I managed to, especially when I was older, I managed to understand him. I managed to have conversations with him, and he would open up his vulnerabilities with me. So that was a positive in that line. So yeah, obviously, if you look at in the family constellation, we call them your heart parents. And I really see him as my heart father, because he had this unbelievable love for my mother and for me. And what he gave up is beyond normal.
And took care of you.
And took care of me, yes, as best as he could, yes.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, it's a harsh period. I know some stories in that time period context, in the Southern African context, as you call it, the harshness of the education, the absolute toughness and heartlessness that some kids were treated with. I know of stories that emerge in the Afrikaans culture about how some children were locked up in a coal shed if they were not behaved. etc., etc. So it was a very tough, difficult time, pre-First World War, after the First World War, and pre and after the Second World War. It was a very difficult period.
The focus was on survival. What do I have to do for my child to survive? It wasn't about parental love. It was about survival. There was no place for gentleness, because if you were soft, you did not survive. And therefore you had to be hardened in order for you to survive. It's a different type of love.
Yeah.
It's not something our young people understand today. But it is what parents did for their children to survive. Because ultimately, humans have survived through difficult times. And sometimes the only thing they could give forward is life. And therefore, in the family constellations, we have this beautiful sentence where we go into, you gave life and I took life. And you gave life and it's enough. And I took life and it's enough. And that is basically the best that people could do.
So in the case of the heart parents, what would be appropriate sentences there?
You gave what you could, and it's enough.
You gave me care and I took your care. Thank you.
Well, the thing is, you can't really say that to a parent who's really hard, is that a child doesn't understand that care. But in my case, where it is the step parent, I can honestly say, you took on a lot. And your sacrifice is honored.
Yeah. I was able to watch our previous recording again, and it was really touchy when I listened to you again, speaking about the gratitude that came out of going back into this process and understanding what happened contextually, and how much gratitude it evokes in one to then come to this point with this perspective.
It's understanding that parents gave everything they could with what they had. And to expect anything more is not fair. Yes, a child always wants more, but you can't ask for what somebody can't give. I can't ask you for $1 million if you don't have the $1 million. Would I like it? Yes. Do you have to give it? No. And therefore, asking for it when you can't give it is asking too much. And so the humility that comes in is to say, whatever you gave is enough. Because let's look at it in the journey of life. That makes you who you are today. That's made me who I am today. And therefore, it is perfect. Therefore, the parent is always the perfect parent. If we look at it, that we've chosen this parent for our life journey.
Definitely. Yes, as you said, I can see how it settles in with me as well. Looking at my father, looking at my mother, how they did the best they could after they lost my firstborn brother that I never met. But how they really did their best with then me and my sister that came after that. It was very big shock for them as a young couple to suddenly lose a young child at the age of 3 to leukemia.
And the thing is, with the availability or non-availability of medical care as it was at that time. And the vastness of our country, where you were grateful for any doctor that could give you some answer. And they were just as baffled by all that they had to deal with, not having the medicines, not having the know-how that we have available today. So our children are really privileged that they are living in a very difficult, in a different time. If I look at the birth of my eldest daughter, which was in Zimbabwe at that time, Rhodesia still at that time. And I believe if it wasn't for my Namibian roots, I would have probably dealt with it a lot different. Traveling to an unknown country, an unknown African country, into a village that didn't even really have a hospital. It had a clinic. And there were some doctors available. With your firstborn. We arrived in Zimbabwe, traveling, giving up everything, lock, stock, and barrel, going to Zimbabwe. Our furniture hadn't arrived yet. And on the flight from Johannesburg to Bulawayo, or Harare, can't even remember, he got ill from the airline the jet that called air on him, and he got pneumonia. So I arrived in Rhodesia with a child who got ill with pneumonia, had such a high fever, pregnant, living in what was a hotel, but was really more like a facility with a couple of rooms. And then having to find out that there was no really proper facility, and there was a doctor, and who was able, fortunately, to prescribe medication, but I couldn't even let him be taken up into the clinic because this child was frightened, this child was scared, and I had to fight for his life. He was 5 years old, but I had to fight for his life in a foreign country. And that was quite scary for me as my first experience with the medical treatment that was available. And then when I then had my daughter, I was 5 months pregnant when we came to Rhodesia. And then having my child with just handing over and being, whatever happens. There was no facility for a incubator. So whatever happened. And yes, I'm grateful that everything went as it did. And fortunately, these doctors that are met with all these different adversities have very, very good instincts. And they just act on their instincts. It is what it is. So yes, and going back into Namibia in that time, it was really limited. So you were lucky if you stayed alive, if you had difficulties.
So one day when we will not be here anymore, our kids can also talk about this and say, it didn't start with me.
It didn't.
It started with way back, and hopefully they can read the book, and hopefully they can listen to these conversations. But today, I think I walk away from this conversation with this overwhelming feeling of the pioneering spirit of our ancestors coming to this continent and did what they did, and did some of it beautifully. Some of it they screwed up, like all of us today. And it's always this, how do we engage with life honestly and authentically? in the end, just recognizing that we're all human.
So if you're talking about the pioneering spirit, my birth father's family was part of the Deutschlandtrekkers.
Ah,
So they traveled from Cape Town through the Karoo, through the Kalahari, and then they settled on the eastern side of Namibia, on the Kalahari side, on the Kalahari side of the Namibia, which is
correct.
the red dunes. The west side is the white dunes, and the east side is the red dunes. And again, I mean, they just had no idea where they were going. They were just going somewhere where they could settle.
Amazing. And he was part of that.
And his parents were part of that. He was born on the farm in the Kalahari, on the Namibian side. So some people settled on the Botswana side, and some people settled on the Namibian side. And so there is again that pioneering spirit. You had to survive. You had to do whatever it took in order to survive. And so my birth father is one of 6 children. I'm not too sure where he fits into the pecking order. He's not the eldest, and he's not the youngest.
So somewhere in the mix.
Somewhere in the mix. But what amazes me about this family that I got to know when I met my birth father is that belief, that strength, that absolute sense of we are who we are, and we take ourselves seriously in who we are. We have survived, and we are survivors. And I think this is really part of a lot of the Afrikaans tradition. Is we've come here and we've survived, and that's made us who we are today. So when I met my birth father, I was very, very fortunate that I got contact with many of my cousins, and there is a strong trend that goes through, and that is we honor life and we honor each other. So I found that beautiful as the outsider coming into that family, as to honoring each other for who we are and acknowledging each other for who we are.
Beautiful. Just for the viewers that don't understand Afrikaans, Deutschlandtrekkers actually means the land of thirst. The ones that were moving through the land of thirst, Deutschlandtrekkers. Actually, they did move through Namibia. Some of them ended up in Angola. There was a whole story about how the Deutschlandtrekkers actually tenaciously moved on to the north as well. Others settled, and others went far north. So yeah, it was the early pioneering spirit of Europeans in Africa. It was amazing history.
Yes, but so the question is, for the young ones to understand, why would I want to explore a land where there is nothing? There is nothing. And there is not a promise of anything. And yet, that's what they did. So it must take some courage to do that. And just imagine that you are with your family going through finding food wherever you can find food, finding water wherever you can find water, and just surviving one day at a time.
Totally mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling. And it's so anti of our life expectations today. But again, the gratitude is we are because they were. They've given life in spite of all the difficulties that they have survived.
Amazing.
And then comes from that side, I want to go back to the religion. What kept the Afrikaners strong was their very strong religious belief system that held them together, that formed their community, and their absolute belief in the higher power of God that was guiding them. So while we today may look at it and say, you know, we're not part of that anymore, I think we need to honor our forefathers for their belief systems in terms of finding the resource in themselves to be able to continue with whatever quest they were following.
Absolutely. So biological father was from an Afrikaans background?
Afrikaans background, yes.
So there's two rivers that flow together here in you.
Yes. The very German river and the very Afrikaans river.
Yeah, beautiful.
Which both have their root somewhere in Europe a long, long, long time ago.
Yeah, yeah. Have you traced it back?
I do. My cousin has traced it back. And I do want to sit down with him one day and go through up the whole family tree. On my father's side. On my mother's side, there's not a big trace.
Father's side, is that Dutch, French, German, or originally?
Van den, that's very Dutch.
Or Dutch, yeah.
Yeah, very Dutch. Yeah. So that is as much as I know about my ancestry. And it's as much as I could go back into. So I hear and I live through the stories that I hear from my brothers, my sisters, and then also my cousins. And I follow the stories that are shared on our WhatsApp group, where they share, you know, their stories in Namibia, their longing for Namibia, and I'm so much part of that. So Namibia is the common ground for my upbringing, for where I come from. That is where I am rooted. That's where my heart lies.
Beautiful.
So I think that brings us to the end of where we want to take it today. And
Yes.
I'm going to encourage people who are looking at this to ask themselves, how did they survive? What did their forefathers survive in order for them to be here today? And maybe also just have a little bit of going back and being gracious in gratitude to the sacrifices of their forefathers. So I want them to actually explore that a little bit. So thank you for this journey that we traveled today, Leon.
Thank you. It was lovely. To the next one.